In 1962, Stan Lee and Steve Ditko were working together on a Marvel Comics magazine scheduled to be canceled within its 15th issue. With nothing to lose and nothing to prove, the two decided to debut a new character in Amazing Fantasy number 15, Spider-Man. The book, starring a nerdy teenager who gained superpowers after being bitten by a radioactive spider, turned out to be one of the most successful comics Marvel had ever sold. Since then, Spider-Man has become one of the most enduring characters in American pop culture. Not only that, but Spidey's also managed to find more success in video games than most, if not all, of his superhero peers. When Lee and Ditko introduced Spider-Man and his alter ego Peter Parker, readers identified with the character and his story almost immediately. Part of this was because he had so much in common with the adolescent audience that shared his adventures, young, misunderstood, and trying to find a place in the world. But his real-life relatable problems weren't all that had readers hooked. Spider-Man had a unique set of powers and a distinctive look that set him apart from the other superheroes on the newsstand. Unlike other comic book heroes, Spider-Man's face was completely covered. Anyone could have been under that mask. It's been said that readers are better able to identify with the character because of this visual anonymity. While the decision to completely conceal Spider-Man's identity may not have been deliberately done for this effect, it's likely that it helped make Spider-Man the perfect superpowered stand-in for players wanting to immerse themselves in his video game adventures. But it would be a while after Spider-Man's introduction in the early 1960s for him to swing into the digital world. In the intervening years, Spider-Man appeared on television in cartoons and live-action series. By the early 1980s, Marvel Comics had learned the value of licensing its characters into other media. So when video games began to gain in popularity, the company saw an opportunity. In 1981, Parker Brothers snapped up licenses to make video games based on Star Wars, Care Bears, and Marvel's Spider-Man. A year later, the company released Spider-Man for the Atari 2600. Despite its hardware limitations, the game still managed to provide players with a relatively authentic Spider-Man experience. Spidey crawled up the side of a building and defused bombs set by his arch-nemesis, the Green Goblin. Players could even swing from webs while trying to avoid the Goblin's web-line-cutting thugs in the building's windows. According to a 2005 interview with Laura Nikolic, the lead programmer on the project, she and her team were free to make the game they wanted to create, within the limits of the system's capabilities, of course. Quote, "No one ever told me how to do a Spider-Man. We had a few conversations with the marketing people, but we would just explain the limitations of the system, and then we'd get our way. They gave us a bunch of comic books, which I read, but I knew Spider-Man. I'd seen the cheesy afternoon shows. So it really wasn't too hard to come up with the game." End quote. Despite Marvel's lack of input on the title, Nikolic and her team managed to come up with an inspired choice for the game's antagonist, the Green Goblin. It turns out the decision was made mostly for technical reasons. Nikolic said that the Goblin, quote, "was the easiest to do because he could fly." All in all, the Atari 2600 game wasn't a bad debut for the webbed wonder. The game was enough of a success that Marvel wanted to put more of their characters into players' hands. For that, they tapped Scott Adams. Adams was a programmer whose company, Adventure International, was making a name for itself in the burgeoning computer game industry. Marvel and Adventure International inked a deal for the developer to create 12 new text-based games based on Marvel characters, and Marvel would also publish tie-in comic books that fleshed out what happened in the games. Adams explains how the arrangement came about in an email interview with Machinima. Quote, "We were contacted by Joe Calamari at Marvel. He was the vice president at the time and later became president of Marvel. He was always looking for new tie-ins for Marvel characters. He wanted to get Marvel into computer gaming, and it appears my name and my company came highly recommended as the place to go." In 1984, Adventure International released Quest Probe Spider-Man, the second in the series after the company had published its first Quest Probe game starring the Incredible Hulk. The text-based adventure game was paired with static images that changed based on the player's in-game actions, which were drawn by actual Marvel Comics artists. Quote, "All the artwork for the characters in-game was set up by Marvel and then transferred by my artist into the game engine or approved by Marvel when we made changes." End quote, recalls Adams. The programmer also served as plotter for the published Quest Probe comics. Quote, "I did the complete storylines for the tie-in comic books, and then they storyboarded them. I approved them, and then they went to final creation." End quote. In the game, Spider-Man was sent on a puzzle-solving, gem-hunting expedition by a brand new villain named Chief Examiner. The villain wasn't just created by Adams, though. He actually was Adams. Adams explains how Marvel decided on the Examiner's unique design. Quote, "The Chief Examiner was going to appear throughout the series. When asked how I wanted him to look, I said, model him on me. Marvel asked me to send in a picture and they would discuss it. When I heard back, they said, yeah, you look evil enough." End quote. While it might not impress modern gamers, Quest Probe included many of Spidey's signature villains as well as his powers, like his spider strength and the ability to crawl on the ceiling. However, the action never took the hero to the New York City skyline, a pretty important part of the character's stories and a prominent feature in the Atari 2600 outing from 1982. Much like the Parker Brothers game, though, technical limitations dictated certain creative decisions, like setting the game indoors. "I had to put Spider-Man inside," says Adams, as his travel abilities would mean folks would be trying to take off in all directions. Ultimately, despite the game's positive reception, Adventure International couldn't stay in business as tastes in video games shifted away from text-based adventures. The company folded in 1985 with only 3 of the Marvel games made. Spider-Man wouldn't make his way back to video games for another 5 years. In 1989, Marvel's license went to a computer game publisher named Paragon Software. Paragon managed to release only 2 games featuring the character, a 1989 team-up called Spider-Man and Captain America in Doctor Doom's Revenge, and 1990's The Amazing Spider-Man. Both improved on gameplay elements featured in previous Spidey titles, like acrobatics and wall-crawling skills. Yet neither one was able to offer gamers the same kind of experience seen in the comics. In Doctor Doom's Revenge, players switched off between the 2 titular characters and fought villains one-on-one. But while some villains like the Rhino or Machete appeared, there were some odd choices of antagonists too. At one point, Spider-Man takes on a robot. Shortly thereafter, Captain America tussles with a gorilla. Needless to say, the game's devotion to comic book continuity didn't seem to be much of a priority. In The Amazing Spider-Man, the hero had to infiltrate Mysterio's hideout in an effort to rescue his wife, Mary Jane. Even though Spidey's wall-crawling and web-swinging powers were on full display, he never threw a punch, lacking any offensive moves. The emphasis here was on the hero using his agility to solve puzzles and make it to the end of the game in one piece. After these 2 entries, Paragon didn't publish any more Spider-Man titles. As Marvel entered the 1990s, the great American comic book boom was waiting right around the corner. In addition, it was becoming clear that home consoles were beating computers in the battle for video game dominance. Soon, kids everywhere would be inundated with more superheroes than ever before, in 4-color funny books, on Saturday morning cartoons, and, of course, on video game consoles. But how much Spider-Man is too much? Fans were about to find out. Tune in next time to see Marvel send in the clones.